All right. Well, thank you, Elise, very much for that generous introduction and invitation to speak. Good evening, bonsoir. It's a real pleasure for me to return this evening to Savannah, which I've only visited once before in 2013, so I'm overdue for a visit. I wanted to thank again Elise for coordinating everything, to my hosts at the Printmakers Inn for a really wonderful experience. I could not have asked for a better stay, so thank you very much. The title of my talk this evening, Southern Stories, French Connections, is, as Elise mentioned, first and foremost inspired by the historic events that transpired right here in Savannah on the 19th and the 20th of March, 1825. So, of course, this is the bicentennial of Lafayette's American tour, and specifically his stop here in Savannah. As Elise mentioned, Lafayette stayed at no more prestigious an address than the Owens-Thomas House, which I was able to tour this afternoon, when I had a great visit. So thank you. I think Darby was here a second ago, had a great tour with her, so thank you very much. Not to make it about myself, it's something of a small world, but my father is actually one of the official Lafayette reenactors traveling around the country at the moment. So this is actually him in New Haven. He's having a ball. He's retired and is now traveling maybe more than I am. This was him in Connecticut. He was just in Charleston last week. He was in Camden and Columbia, where we're going to end the talk tonight, but not to give things away. Anyways, getting around, having a blast. Now, don't get me wrong, I am certainly Team Lafayette. But the Franco-American story is much longer, it's much broader, it's quite diverse. Tonight, objects and images are going to help fill in the blanks for us, taking us on a longer journey through time from the 16th century, from the 1500s, through the 19th. So I want to start with an object, not a southern one, but we'll get there, I promise. This is a French bell. It was cast in France in the port of La Rochelle. I just saw a painting of that at Telfair, by the way, so something was really following me around. But this was cast in France in 1741. That's 11 years before this bell's slightly more famous British cousin was cast, the one that ended up in Philadelphia and is also cracked. As described on the plaque, you can see that this incredibly heavy object made its way across the Atlantic Ocean, up the winding Mississippi River, to be used in a church, a Roman Catholic church in Kaskaskia, Illinois, which is a kind of farming, settlement, trading post, founded by French and Canadian colonists in 1703. That French inscription you see on the bell reads, "To the Church of the Illinois by effort of the overseas king." So this is Louis XV, making the bell a truly royal gift to the residents of this remote French colonial outpost in what is now the Midwest. If we fast forward to 1778, the 4th of July, George Rogers Clark and his men reached Kaskaskia, then home to a rather small British garrison. No shots were fired. The British were outnumbered. They quickly surrendered. Nonetheless, this bell was rung to herald an American victory, thus earning its nickname of Liberty Bell of the West. So that this bell was rung in relation to at least one revolutionary battle and a victory, I think is food for thought when we consider what's happening next year, the 250th of the Declaration of Independence. Having said that, these are the kinds of objects and stories that so interest me, not because of those anniversaries, which are great, but because they encourage us to consider a wider, more holistic image of early America, one that includes people who spoke French and who belonged to a larger French diaspora that extended from Canada to the Caribbean. So it's like they say, once you start looking for French people, you start finding them everywhere. When Savannah was founded in the 1730s, as you all know, the town's residents were all too keenly aware that they had Spanish-speaking Catholic neighbors to the south, Florida. They were also aware of their French-speaking, also Catholic neighbors. Some, like those north in Canada, were at a more comfortable distance. But looking west, that string of French forts, ports, and inland trading posts in present-day Louisiana, as well as Alabama and Mississippi, were reminders that the French were never far off. So I always show a map like this to kind of explain the extent of these territorial ambitions Some were more pipe dream than reality, but the aspirations were certainly there if you were a French cartographer in the 1700s or even the 1600s. Canada and Louisiana were French colonies that together formed a larger entity called New France, kind of like New England. So if you see on the map, you'll notice Louisiana is actually these two parts, Upper and Lower Louisiana, with Upper Louisiana occupying much of the Midwest and Lower Louisiana the Gulf Coast. New France was first claimed in 1534, and it was at its height in 1750, so the map you more or less see here on screen. By that period, New France stretched from Labrador across the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico. Quebec had been founded in 1608 as an imperial capital. The fur trade hub of Montreal followed in 1642. New Orleans, the capital of Louisiana, was one of the last urban settlements, only founded in 1718. I'm sorry, that's still a little bit before Savannah. So again, not to rub it in anyone's faces. However, St. Louis, Missouri, the last French outpost, was actually founded in 1764. They hadn't yet gotten word that New France was no more, but they founded it anyway, named it after a French king and saint. So at this point, 1763, we see Canada and Spanish Florida becoming the newest British colonies. A reminder that there were never 13 colonies, just 13 rebellious or bad ones, and not until 1776. Spain took New Orleans and that part of Louisiana west of the Mississippi. So in terms of population and just peopling of this region of New France, the population stood about 60,000 people in 1760. We can compare that to the approximately 1 million people who called British North America home in that same period. So having kind of done that overview, which I know is sort of a little superficial, but just to get our bearings, I want to take us back to the beginning, to 1534, the year that New France was born, at least on a map. So that same year, 1534, a French mariner and explorer, Jacques Cartier, first set sail for a westward passage to Asia. He ended up in Canada. He planted a tall wooden cross on the Gaspé Peninsula, overlooking the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and through this action claimed the territory for the King of France, calling it New France. So very, very original. But if this expedition in 1534 represents the first instance of a French claim to any part of North America, it was followed only 30 years later by another French contingent that ended up in a very different place, the southeast. Making landfall in 1562, 150 French explorers and colonists, led by a man named Jean Ribault, disembarked at Paris Island, so one of the sea islands. I think it's closest to like Beaufort, South Carolina, so in that area, not too far away. The group consisted primarily not of French Catholics, but French Protestants, specifically the Calvinists, known as Huguenots. Sometimes you hear Huguenot. It's Huguenot in French, so you have to decide if you're going to pronounce that H or not to really make it worth the pronunciation effort. But Huguenot itself is something of a slur in the period. It's not really quite clear where the name comes from, but it's sort of a derogatory term that gets embraced, reappropriated by these people eventually. The fortified Huguenot settlement of Charles-le-Fort, Charles Fort, was founded in 1562, named for the king, Charles IX, and it was followed by a second fort, Fort Caroline, again in reference to the king. This second fort, Caroline, was founded by another Huguenot by the name of Laudonnière, who you see here at upper right. And Fort Caroline stood near what is now Jacksonville, Florida. A member of the Laudonnière expedition was a man by the name of Jacques Lemoine, a Huguenot cartographer who had been sent to the region on order by the king to make a visual record of local plants and animals as well as native people. What you're seeing is a copy of an original, now lost drawing attributed to Lemoine, who might have actually made these drawings when he went back to France based on memory. But we see him, we see the French leader Laudonnière meeting with a Timucuan leader looking at a monument erected by Ribault in 1562. So again, this is happening pretty quickly in the decade of the 1560s. This monument was apparently emblazoned, at least according to this image, with the royal arms of France. So again, symbolic of French claims to the region. It's a very idyllic and idealized scene. Again, these are based on probably originals by Lemoine, but the original drawings done here, or at least done in France or England, don't survive. But also based on Lemoine's work, the map of French Florida at left. Dates to the mid-18th century, but it records those same aspirations. So you can see all the waterways are named for rivers in France. There's a Seine, there's a Loire, the Savannah is the Charente, so not what we see on our maps today, a pipe dream that was ultimately not to be. So that first French settlement, Charles-le-Fort, was more or less abandoned by 1563, quickly taken over by the Spanish. Fort Caroline saw the Spanish wage an actual all-out attack in 1565, which saw most of the Huguenots chased into the swamps, massacred outright. So important to remember that not only is there an ongoing competition for the Americas between European powers, but these conflicts are taking place against a backdrop of the wars of religion in France, so Spanish Catholics, French Protestants, in as unlikely a place as Florida and South Carolina today. So in the end, Spanish Florida was a rather short-lived experiment, but still I think a fascinating and largely understudied chapter of American history. A lot of surprises, and this includes the fact that the first European artist known or believed to have worked in what would become the US was right there recording things on the spot, and that is Jacques Lemoine. So I'm showing you here some printed versions of his drawings that were circulated in print form and in books. But I mentioned Lemoine before. He survived that 1565 attack on Fort Caroline, ended up in France, left just in time for the Bartholomew's Day massacre, ends up in England where he dies, and is able to publish versions of his work. They're published posthumously by Theodore de Brie, so the very famous printer. What's really interesting about these images that accompany a narrative of that 1564 voyage to Florida is the fact that Lemoine wrote this account himself, and it's one of the most important accounts of early European exploration in North America. Also, just looking at these images, has anyone ever seen these before? Oh, amazing. Well, great. Perfect. If you start looking for them, you'll also start seeing them everywhere because versions continued to be printed into the 19th century. These were really influential pictures that you see used for Native people from New York, from Massachusetts. They don't care that they're actually supposed to be from Florida. So you can see that it's complicated and confusing, but these are very influential as far as works of art go. They're now at the National Portrait Gallery, where they were collected as depictions, portraits of actual Florida natives, let alone French explorers. So not a painted portrait, but the engraved image is a way of sort of diffusing that likeness. So ironically enough, this same semi-tropical region of greater Low Country saw a second wave of immigration by the French, again Protestant, a century later. But by this point, the map had been redrawn. This was now a firmly Anglo possession with a royal charter given by Charles II in 1663, and I'm talking about South Carolina here. Georgia, of course, comes a couple years later. But Huguenot migration to South Carolina is part of a larger diaspora that began in the second half of the 1600s. The backstory goes back to the 1500s, though, 1598, when the king, Henry IV, had signed into law the Edict of Nantes, so a town in Brittany. But this was an important law in that it afforded Protestants the right to worship freely, unmolested, legally, publicly. In 1685, the king's grandson, this is Louis XIV, decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes and brought about a huge wave of state persecution of these French Calvinists. As the king is famously held to have said, it was to be one faith, one law, one king that ruled in France. So sensing this mounting religious tension and unwilling to endure the kind of persecution that their ancestors had experienced in the 16th century, Huguenots began leaving France en masse. Some went to England, others chose the Netherlands, neighboring Protestant German states, but America was also an option. It was South Carolina that loomed especially large in the Huguenot legacy, with the first Huguenots arriving in Charleston in 1679. They also went to New York. They ended up in a lot of different places, Boston as well. Tragically for France, the Huguenot diaspora was something of a brain drain. These were some of the best craftspeople, artists, philosophers, writers, but they were done, and they were putting France behind them and looking for greener pastures. When it came to the arts, Huguenots were among the best French artists, working as furniture makers, upholsterers, silversmiths, and just designers in their own right. Louis XIV himself had employed many to decorate Versailles in the 17th century, as well as other royal palaces. But his loss was everyone else's gain. And some of the most interesting examples, I think, of early Southern decorative arts have a French influence that we have, by and large, attributed to Huguenot, refugee, exile craftspeople. Take, for example, these two-turned armchairs with tall, straight banister backs that harken back to the 17th century precedents. It's that vertical upper back comprised of a large open frame that distinguishes both chairs, or the chair on the right, I should say. Little support for the sitter, but it's a configuration that suggests the chair was used with a cushion. We call these squabs in English, carreau in French, which is just literally a square or rectangle. You could also use a cushion on that plank seat. So these tied cushions were often employed on French and other continental European furniture, seat furniture forms, not often used in British or Anglo-American contexts, but things change, tastes shift. So it's been suggested that this tradition of the removable seat cushions came to America with the Huguenots. And so that's the example you see at right, restored to how it may have appeared with that reproduction green woolen and fringed seat cushion. In comparison, the chair at left exhibits similar design elements also associated with the Huguenots, who were very famous, among other things, as turners, as wood turners. So check out those turn spindles that you see set into square rectangular rails in cross-section. Again, features you see on French chairs, cradles, pews, I mean, really any other furniture form. They're great, ironically enough, confessional doors in southwestern France. Not a space that Huguenots would have been in, but they were receiving commissions to do these kinds of jobs also. They were so skilled at turning. So again, it stands to reason that a scattering of French cultural traditions, including this kind of chair making, was introduced into places like Virginia, the Carolinas, by the Huguenots, and where they survived for generations. Another really fantastic survivor from early South Carolina is this couch, we think probably made in Charleston, and whose design also points to French influence. So note the inverted kind of cup shape of the center splat, which I will show you here. I'll come back to the overall in just a second, along with those double vase-shaped or kind of vasiform spindles, all of which embody this kind of provincial take on high Baroque style of the sort pioneered by French Huguenots in Europe and North America, both before and after they left France. So let me go back to the actual overall. In the 17th and 18th centuries, you see I call this a couch. Couch and sofa describe very different forms in this period. The sofa has an arm on each end and a back, a full-width back, intended for upright sitting. This is not lounge furniture. The couch, on the other hand, what you see here, is basically a long bench with a narrow back or a headrest at one end that's often adjustable, hinged for, your comfort. As far as furniture goes, this is about leisure. It's not about labor. And it connoted elite ideals of comfort, ease, and fashionability. Upholstered, caned couches like this one were used with cushions as well. This couch's regional provenance, together with those details gleaned from local inventories, lists of people's things at the time of their death, suggest that the couch may have been used in tandem with a kind of gauze canopy. This was for keeping mosquitoes at bay. The same inventories that mention daybeds and couches often refer to these canopies, which were both utilitarian and fashionable. They were also used over actual beds, and they were referred to locally, according to these inventories, as pavilions, a word whose etymological origins can be traced back to the French word pavillon, pavilion also, which was used to describe elaborate upholstery hangings, often over beds. So let me go back just to show you again the great detail here of this fantastic survivor. It's the only couch with a South Carolina provenance known to exist. So it's been surmised that this vocabulary, the pavilion, is indicative also again of Huguenot influence that shaped furniture as much as local vocabulary, language. So again, even if we just zoom in on the headrest, it's this fantastic tour de force of carving, of turning, the sort that Huguenot craftspeople were known for in Europe and undoubtedly replicated for clients here in America. We don't know who owned this couch, but it's interesting to think about how, at least according to inventories, this kind of thing appealed to people across the confessional border. So whether they were Anglican or Huguenot, people liked and owned these kinds of things. So I think it's something we can speculate on the larger cultural impact of the Huguenot makers as designers with the power to shape local tastes. Also really hits home the fact that we are dealing not with some monolithic Anglo-colonial culture, but it's this kind of cross-cultural fusion from the very beginning with English, Germanic, French pieces forming a larger puzzle, a kind of cultural continuum. Now, I mentioned 45 Huguenots who arrived in Charleston in 1679, but their numbers would continue to grow. So between 1680 and 1710, we see the largest influx of Huguenots into South Carolina. At least one of them was an artist known to us by name. This is Henrietta de Beaulieu Daring Johnston, probably born Henriette, but anglicized her name, who worked in Charleston making pastel portraits of early South Carolinians like this lady, Frances Lescott, Lescaut, depending on who you ask, shown here at age 11. And what's interesting about this particular sitter, again, she's a young girl, but she's the daughter of the Huguenot pastor of Charleston's church. He was a pastor from 1700 to 1719, Paul Lescaut, and also served in the 1730s. The Reverend Lescaut was born in France and apparently never learned English. He could only communicate in French or Latin. So again, a good reminder of early America's linguistic diversity. Now, with respect to the artist herself, and I'll just call her Henrietta, she has been attributed a number of notable firsts in the realm of American art history. She is, among other things, considered, I will just read it off, the earliest artist to work in pastels in colonial America. Yes. By extension, the US, right? She was the first professional woman artist to pursue a career in colonial America. Yes. And also the first portraitist of the American South. Maybe a little debatable. But I want to be clear about one thing, is that what I've mentioned is more or less true, but Henrietta can do even better. I would go so far as to say she is, in fact, the first professional artist, period, to work in what would become the United States. She has a significant corpus of extant work. She worked for money. She made money. I think that's a professional artist. The end. So I'll fight someone if you want to talk about it later. But you might be wondering, let me actually first say also that there are 55 extant pastel portraits signed by or attributed to Henrietta. There are others that we know existed. We don't know where they are now, but they are documented in the record. So they range in quality and condition, as you can see here. This is not the most conducive climate for pastel, so understandable. But what I want to also add is if you haven't already heard of Henrietta, you might be wondering, well, why not? Again, I think it's a pretty incredible claim to fame. I think there are a few reasons, not least of which is why, or rather the way we teach American art before 1800, the fact that she was born in Europe, not in America, but I don't care. She still had her career, for the most part, in North America, and I think that's pretty extraordinary. So there are also things we don't know about her. We don't know specifically where she was born, but most sources will say she was born in Brittany, in the town of Rennes, which stands to reason. We know her parents were Huguenots. They eventually ended up in London, where Henrietta married an Englishman at the age of 20 in 1694. So they're getting to London right before or in the immediate wake of the Edict of Nantes being revoked. So this all kind of makes sense. I mentioned Henrietta marries Robert Daring in London in 1694. They end up in Dublin, where Robert died in 1704. Henrietta married an Anglican clergyman, Gideon Johnston, in Dublin in 1705, and 3 years later followed him to South Carolina, where he was to work as kind of a missionary minister in the early colony. Now, having already demonstrated considerable talent for pastels in Ireland, Henrietta quickly began taking commissions for portraits in this fragile medium right here in the Southeast. I should add that pastels are a very French medium in the sense that there are a lot of French artists who really pioneer working in this particular medium and in portraits specifically. Henrietta was actually using French pastels, so a fun French connection, whether she wanted to admit that or not. She knew they were the best, and she sought them out when she went back to London in, I think in 1710 or so. Why pastels? Not only were pastels fashionable, comparatively affordable, but they could be finished in a very short amount of time, often in a matter of days, which added, I think, to their novelty. Artists working in this chalk-like medium took advantage of the luminous visual effects of pastels to create these, and their tonality, I would say, to create these arresting, realistic portraits. And just to give you a sense of the support she had at home, we see the Reverend Gideon Johnston writing back to a patron in England that were it not for the assistance my wife gives by drawing of pictures, I should not be able to live. So again, she's a working woman, she's professional, she's certainly a member of the elite, and this is a suitably refined feminine pursuit, but it's actually making money for the family in Charleston. That Henrietta's talents, like I said, constituted so significant a source of income for the Johnstons is telling. And I want to move now to this, just to give you a sense of the variety of portraits that survive and their quality. Here we're seeing a couple, Pierre Bacot, born in France in 1671, who immigrated with his family to South Carolina in 1685, so that important year with the Edict of Nantes. He married his first wife, Marianne, in Charleston in 1705. And so these are among the earliest of Henrietta's likenesses. It's, as far as her work goes, this pair's a knockout. They're at the Met for a reason. Considering their early dates, I mean, really just pretty extraordinary. Another portrait of a Charleston Huguenot is among the artist's most charming. This is, we can call her Mademoiselle Chatigny, who appears with a suitably light complexion offset by these rosy cheeks and a red hair ribbon, an elegant likeness completed in 1711 when she was just 6 years old. She later married Nathaniel Broughton, who inherited Mulberry Plantation on the Cooper River. So as we've seen, many of Henrietta's patrons came from the local Huguenot community. I think her own religious background and her experience of exile, first in England, then Ireland, then South Carolina, would only have helped to endear her to this community, even though she was married to an Anglican herself. So as it was, her portraits constitute a veritable who's who of early South Carolina Huguenots. Like I mentioned, some, like Bacot, were born in France, came to South Carolina as children. Others were born here and grew up here, raised in the Southeast. But I love these portraits. Again, they're about 55, so you can look at a good cross-section just by Googling. But a real rare face-to-face encounter with these people of the past, the same kind of people who might have owned furniture, like that beautiful daybed we just saw a second ago. Now, it's important to note that although the Huguenots continued to hold services in their own church, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the church in Charleston. They would continue to bear French surnames and give French first names to their children. They did eventually come to be assimilated within South Carolina's larger Anglo-American majority. These things happen. We see it happening here. We see Gabriel Manigault, as he might have said it, or his parents would have said it, with his wife Anne Ashby, so certainly an Anglo name, an Anglo partner. But at the onset of their arrival, the Huguenots in Charleston formed a tight-knit minority of religious and political refugees. They saw in America the same promise and potential that has always attracted immigration to this country. It's an American story, and it's one whose roots stretch back to France in the 1600s. Now, I'm going to switch gears entirely now. We started with Protestants. I'm going to move to Catholics. So, of course, the early American South was in part permanently settled by French immigrants who lived under actual French rule as subjects of the King of France. Nowhere more compellingly bears witness to this history in the South than New Orleans, a city that has a lot in common with Savannah. Again, founded in 1718 on a bend in the Mississippi, New Orleans is a place that continues to beguile, baffle, infuriate, I think because, at least on the surface, it seems so unlike any other American city. But in many ways, I think this uniqueness has been exaggerated. New Orleans has a lot in common with other port towns, including Savannah, including places like Mérida in Mexico, Havana, Cuba, and even Montreal in Canada. Remember, it was a group of Montrealers, not metropolitan Frenchmen, who founded New Orleans in 1718. But it wasn't just men who built New Orleans, let alone shaped it into the place that it is today. It's actually women who played a huge role, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and these are the stories we're telling, and they really help us understand a more, I think, accurate, realistic view of who was moving and shaking things in a lot of these early American places. So symbolic, I think, of this history is the old Ursuline, or if you're from New Orleans, Ursuline Convent, the city's oldest building, also the oldest in the lower Mississippi Valley. It's definitely one of my favorite American buildings. But to give you the background on these women, who they were, this convent, the Ursulines were sent by Louis XV in 1727. He was 17 years old. But he sent the nuns to New Orleans to run a hospital and oversee female education in the colony. These French Ursuline nuns arrived in 1727, a timber-framed convent with walls built of mud and Spanish moss was completed for them in 1734. Didn't work out. The southern humidity, combined with hurricanes from the Gulf, immediately undermined that building's stability. So the earlier convent was replaced by the building you see here, a masonry, stuccoed convent designed in 1745 by a royal military engineer, finished by 1753. And what I love most about this is that it's a little piece of Normandy dropped on the Mississippi. I mean, and I don't know if I have a pointer here, but I will just say that what we're seeing is in the 18th century, what was the back of the convent. The front faced the river, which was a little bit closer than what it is today. And then that kind of chapel that comes off the side, that's a later 19th century addition. So just focus on the central core, the very French-looking 18th century structure. Now, I mentioned that the first convent from the 1730s was torn down to make this more modern, permanent structure that survives. But pieces were salvaged, including this great staircase made of local cypress with a wrought iron handrail. Check out you can kind of see the little curlies and then the carved acanthus that are extending on this. A really incredible object to have. I love that they salvaged it and kept it in as late as the 1750s, incorporating it within this important building. That was really one of the grandest in early New Orleans, and that also survived multiple fires. Now, the Colonial Convent, where we just were, was occupied until 1824, when it was given over to the bishop as his residence. The nuns moved into a new convent on Dauphine Street. The sisters, however, did not hesitate to bring certain things with them, including furniture that had by then, this is the 1820s, served almost 100 years, multiple generations of sisters, their students, and their boarders. Now, among these sort of antiques, as it were, vintage furnishings that they kept and recycled in their new convent, were refectory tables from the convent's dining hall or cafeteria. So at 12 feet in length, the table you see at right is among the oldest pieces, documented pieces of Louisiana furniture to survive to the present day. There are actually two of these, both in private collections. This is the bigger one, It's the same table you see if you were to go 1, 2, 3. The table at right is the one that's in the middle. This one is a copy, it's a reproduction. The other extant table in a different collection is a little bit smaller. But again, one of the oldest documented pieces of local Louisiana furniture made by local joiners. As you can see, the owners still used their table until fairly recently. Both of these historic tables exhibit really kind of rudimentary traditional mortise and tenon joinery, so basically differing little from medieval furniture, things made in France, only different and American because they're made of walnut, poplar, and cypress, right? It's a fun table if you notice all these drawers that come out and go both ways. We call these through drawers, meaning they slide through to open on either side of the table. This kind of central partition could be accessed. It was slotted laterally into each drawer, and it was a way to keep items within reach. So the nuns, who by this point were metropolitan French-born women, French Creole or colonial-born women, and even some Native American women, they could sit face to face and share a single drawer for their spoon, their knives, their napkins, their forks eventually. And I know I mentioned the word Creole, I probably don't have to define it, but I use it in the most ecumenical, historical way, just to refer to someone who was born in America with one parent who was not indigenous or Native American. So it's not a racial designation, it just refers to colonial birth. Now, in addition to these big tables, the Ursuline convent revealed these beautiful objects. Smaller tables, but again, early examples of furniture that were taken from the old colonial convent to the new one in the 1820s, sold at auction, I think, in the 70s when they moved into a new building. Inventories, again, a list of people's effects, personal property at the times of their death, from Louisiana, from Canada, from the Caribbean, refer to small portable tables like these. They were certainly ubiquitous in French colonial homes. And remained in vogue well after the period of French colonial rule. Again, a lot of these have surfaced in southern Louisiana, some of local construction. There's at least one that was probably imported from the Caribbean. I'm showing you here 2 Louisiana examples though, but all boast these graceful cabriole legs, a hallmark of a very French style, the Rococo, terminating in these delicately carved cloven hooves. So we call this pied de biche, deer foot, deer hoof, in French, although that can refer to just the cabriole with or without hooves, based on the records. Again, very French in feel, basically made like French tables, but American by virtue of their use of cypress and local walnut. These tables were multi-purpose. They could be used for really anything you liked: reading, writing, playing games, serving coffee. I've actually had coffee on the table at left, so that was a fun core memory for me, meeting the collectors who still have these objects, care for them to the present day, and use them. A nice reminder that history repeats itself, and these beautiful tables are, again, no less useful today than they were when first made. The table at right is one of my favorites, this kind of saltier or X stretcher table, probably served as a nightstand or a bedside table. A really graceful piece, I think, that bears witness to the skills of an immigrant or a colonial-born carver. Your guess is as good as mine. But again, really incredible for any of these objects to have survived at all. I mentioned New Orleans was devastated by fires in 1788 and again in 1794. The convent, where these objects presumably were in those years, was spared. But roughly 3/4 of New Orleans burned. So much was lost: buildings, their contents. Amazingly, nobody died. But just to pivot a little bit beyond the South for just a second, I mentioned that cabriole leg tables were very popular in Louisiana. Others survived that show that they were owned not just by the nuns, but also by lay people. So the examples you see here could be described as alike, but different. The table at left, presumably made in New Orleans, very similar to the ones we saw from the convent, perhaps made by the same shop that supplied the nuns. In comparison, the table at right was made in the early 19th century, and it descended in the Gagné family from Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, a place whose first European visitors were French, and whose oldest city, Green Bay, started as a trading post founded by a French explorer in 1634. That's only 14 years after 1620 and the Pilgrims, right? So almost 100 years before Savannah. But time flies. So again, French people really were everywhere in North America, and so too was French style. So you see how this Wisconsin table stubbornly clings to those French cabriole legs and the scalloped skirt we see on the much sleeker southern Louisiana version. You can also just make out the kind of fluting on the front legs. So it's definitely doing the most in a very remote borderland, frontier, but it's doing a lot. And I think, again, an example of this larger puzzle, this continuum of French design that was transatlantic, trans-regional, transcontinental. So we're getting close to the end, but with respect to furniture, it is the armoire, the kind of wardrobe, that I think is the most emblematic of French cultural affinity in North America. Again, we're talking about a kind of wardrobe used for clothing, house table linens, tablewares, glasses, plates, things like that. A very versatile form, lent itself very well to, again, that Rococo style. This example probably made in New Orleans, walnut, with imported brass fiche hinges. What's really extraordinary about this piece is that it's one of the few examples of Louisiana furniture to include that French motif, the fleur-de-lis. So the stylized lily that is a symbol of the French monarchy, the province of Quebec, still to this day. So a really unique detail that we don't often see. When we look at when this piece was made, we think in roughly 1770 to 90, maybe a little bit earlier. There's some interesting things happening in Louisiana at the time that I think, it's a Southern history that we don't often think about. In the 1760s, I mentioned Louisiana is basically traded. It goes to Spain. The Spanish send a governor. They send people to take over the colony. It doesn't really work out. The locals are not having it. They chase the governor out of town. It's a full-force rebellion against these new Spanish overlords. And so most simply hoped to reverse the king's decision. They just wanted to go back to France. But there was some talk, and it's still debatable the extent to which they would have gone, but there was some discussion of creating an independent republic in Louisiana with New Orleans as its capital. So that is 8 years before the Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia, which eventually becomes a short-lived capital of another republic that does live to see the light of day. The resistance was eventually defeated. Many were executed, sent to Cuba, imprisoned. The record is silent on the matter, but I love objects like this, which allow us to kind of speculate on who or what inspired the design of an object made right about the time of these dramatic events. It's a great reminder, more basically, that the armoire was a form that continued to speak French no matter who was in charge politically. So I want to wrap things up with one more revolution, not the American, but the Haitian. And we're going to actually come back here to Savannah. So Haiti, just to kind of catch anyone up who doesn't know, Haiti is on the western side, western half of the island of Hispaniola. The eastern half is the now Dominican Republic, but it was a Spanish colony, also called Saint-Domingue or Santo Domingo. Saint-Domingue for the French, Santo Domingo for the Spanish. Settled in the 17th century by the French. And by 1750, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, that would become Haiti, was France's most valuable colony. They kept that over Canada for a reason. The reason was sugar, right? So 40% of the sugar and also 60% of the coffee imported by Europe during this time came from French Haiti, from Saint-Domingue. It was a colony that was so wealthy. It was the Paris of the Antilles. But it gave rise to a brutal, oppressive society that really, the shoe was about to drop, I think is the expression. So by 1789, the population of the French colony of Saint-Domingue stood at about 556,000 people altogether. That's 32,000 whites, 24,000 free people of color, and 500,000 enslaved people of African birth or descent. That last figure accounts for just about half of all the enslaved in the entire Caribbean. It's a lot of people. 1789 was also a year of revolution in France. Those ideas traveled all over Europe and across to the Americas, North, Central, and South. Those, again, by 1791, the ideals had reached Saint-Domingue, and local free people of color and enslaved people rose up. They would go on to create Haiti, the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere, also the first and only country to self-liberate from slavery. Now, the Haitian Revolution also brought about a series of diasporas. We started with the Huguenots. Now I'm moving to a different sort of context, but one that I think kind of brings us full circle. A series of diasporas, of migrations that transcended the color line, with many of the island's inhabitants, free and enslaved, black, white, mixed race, traveling to places like Cuba and the United States. There's hardly a major American port in this period that did not see some influx of Haitian refugees. Savannah was no different, and I was really delighted the other day, literally yesterday, to go and see some of these places, having never been before, and to really kind of discover this history for myself. So thank you and congratulations for preserving it. It's no mean feat, and I don't take it for granted. So really extraordinary history that is local, but also very global and transcends state lines, national borders. I mean, really just amazing to be able to still see this above ground. I studied colonial New Orleans and it all burned. So this is really extraordinary to be able to see these things in the flesh. If you know me from Instagram, you know I love gravestones, and the first place I went was the Colonial Cemetery. I was struck to see several gravestones for French Haitian refugees. Denis Cotonneau de Nicotineux, a Frenchman who ends up in Haiti, then goes to Pennsylvania before coming here. He's a Revolutionary War hero. Again, really, really cool stories that certainly deserve to be taught and celebrated and just told. I was also fascinated to learn yesterday of the role played by these Haitian refugees in the founding of Savannah's Catholic Cathedral Basilica in the 1790s. Remember, in 1733, Catholics were barred from Georgia, and within 60 years, half century or so, they're here creating a congregation that becomes a basilica. I mean, that's amazing. What a short turnaround. Also, love an old house, and there is a Creole-style, West Indies-style plantation house right here in Savannah, not far up the road from where I'm staying, that still stands on Abercorn Street. So again, really, really incredible stuff, just kind of hiding in plain sight. Now, the Haitian refugees that I'm talking about were not limited to wealthy plantation owners, however. There were also craftspeople, a lot of silversmiths, cooks, chefs, upholsterers, furniture makers who went to places like Philadelphia. People like this gentleman, Chaudron, who was actually French, but he went to Philadelphia from Haiti, where he had been working for a number of years in 1793, whereupon he retailed French silver plate. He also published a French newspaper. So Philadelphia is a real hub of kind of the Franco diaspora. We have royal exiles, we have, again, these cooks, upholsterers, chefs, hairdressers, wig makers. They're all going to what's then the capital of the United States, but they're also coming here. Chaudron is making hollowware, so these kinds of things. It's not, I wouldn't really see this as especially French. It's kind of generic empire. It really kind of appeals to the Anglo clientele living in Philadelphia. But what's really interesting, I think, about this particular silversmith, number one, he partners with a Bavarian silversmith, Anthony Rash, who would move to New Orleans in 1820. And Chaudron ends up in the South eventually, too, for very different reasons. He's one of the founders of an ill-fated colony called the Vine and Olive Colony near Demopolis, Alabama. So in 1817, right before the panic, the United States Congress allocates about 900 acres, 880 acres, to be settled by French political exiles. And Chaudron and his family buy that land, and it's this kind of bid to get people to buy the property. It doesn't work out. However, Chaudron does not go back to Philadelphia. He goes to Mobile, Alabama, where he spends the rest of his life. So he's there for about 25 years. And in 1825, he is host to Lafayette. So it's, again, the places you'll go. And I think it's very funny. He ends up in Mobile, which is founded by the French in 1702 as the capital of Louisiana. Other Haitian silversmiths stayed closer to home before leaving the island. So, for example, here, Pierre Lamotte, he relocated first to Cuba in about 1803, But Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and Spain in 1807 and in 1808, respectively, saw the Spanish crown basically expel all of these potential enemy subjects, refugees from the former French colony. And so we see more than 10,000 Haitian exiles leave Cuba in 1809, 1810, and they go to New Orleans. So early examples of this New Orleans, Louisiana silver by La Motte include this really great four-tined fork that you see at left, recalls earlier French and even Canadian silver forms from the French colonial period. La Motte was a Francophone who may have also spoken Spanish given the time he spent in Cuba, but he was easily assimilated into this Creole society that was New Orleans and did not hesitate to seek out new Anglo-American clients. The bilingual inscription you see on the engraved brass plate at right identifies him by trade in French and in English. This oval plate, we think, was used by La Motte to advertise his shop at 52 Royal Street on the edge of the French Quarter. The reverse of this same plate features slightly later engraving with the name of La Motte's son, Jean-Baptiste, whose occupation is likewise given in both English and French. Also born in Haiti, this younger La Motte was still working in New Orleans on the eve of the Civil War. So this La Motte family flatware, serving pieces including ladles, tumblers, and other forms, I think embody the legacy of these Creole craftspeople for whom memories of the Caribbean and of a French past were not relegated to a distant past. It was their moment, their immediate moment. So one last object that I'm going to leave you with is this example, this object made by another Haitian silversmith born in Haiti on the eve of the Revolution. This is Louis Boudot, who chose Charleston over New Orleans when he left in 1809. 2 years later, he married a woman, also Haitian, Eloise Simonet, and together the couple raised 3 children in South Carolina. Likely assisted by his wife, Boudot was a silversmith, a watchmaker, and a jeweler. Now, a few things served to set the Boudots apart from their local competition. Both were free people of color. And I have to say, I was really struck today, the wall of names at the Owens-Thomas House. Looking at some of those names, you see these French names that I really just have to wonder, under what circumstances did they come to Savannah? Again, these people are moving, these objects are moving, styles, taste. It's a volatile, revolutionary moment, borne out in the archival record as much as the material record. So again, really great to see you all taking that seriously, really, really compelling stuff. So I mentioned that the Boudots were French-speaking, likely fluent in Haitian Creole as well, and they were free people of color. But none of those things precluded them from receiving a rather prestigious commission from the state's governor, Richard Manning, for this map case. So as you've already probably figured out, the recipient was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was presented this gift during his visit to South Carolina, to the state capital, in March 1825. The inscription reads, "In tracing your route through our territory, every inhabited spot will recall to your memory the devotion and affection of a grateful people." It's a fancy silver box, but it says a lot. Boudot received $162 for this work, and he would write to the governor, so he was literate. "I need not add the gratification I feel on being selected by your excellency as jeweler for General Lafayette, and the praises which has been bestowed by the public on the design and workmanship of the same." And I can't help but wonder what Boudot might have thought of Lafayette himself, an ardent abolitionist traveling through the antebellum South in this particular moment. Now, Boudot died only 2 years later in 1827, leaving his widow to administer his estate, but also continue their work for another decade. Assisted by her daughter, the widow Boudot would continue to work for another decade, paying cash for gold and silver and carrying on the jewelry business in all its branches. A number of Boudot-made objects survive, including this decanter label, also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, several pap boats, these small kind of cups for feeding invalids and infants. Lafayette's map case, however, is without question the grandest extant commission, and I think brings us full circle today. There are so many more things I could have talked about, so I appreciate your indulgence. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but one thing I think is certain. This particular object lesson, like the others that I've shared this evening, underscores, I think, a vibrant, multifaceted, and often surprising legacy of a French North America. Not only that, but we have more than a few Southern stories to remind us of those same French connections. So I will cede the floor. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Et voilà. I think, number one, it's a great point, yes. The French verb coucher, which means to lie down horizontally. So yes, again, it's this idea of comfort and lying down. It's a piece of furniture you could find in a very well-to-do home in a space that was meant to impress by virtue of the rest of the furnishings. And that ideal of comfort and being at ease, the purview of the elite who had the time and the money to lie down like that. As for the second point, yeah, I didn't want to spend too much time on Lafayette because I think he has been getting a lot of airtime, which is fine. He totally deserves it. But I think these stories help to really, I think, make Lafayette a little more, I think it rounds out his story too. And it's important to remember, and I could have gotten into so many other tangents and other stories. I'm in New England where I work, and when you read about the really visceral early colonial era anti-Catholicism and anti-French sentiment, I mean, these are people who know they have a border, New York, New England, with Canada right across the border. They're burning the Pope in effigy in Boston until George Washington tells them, all right, we really got to stop doing this. And so it's actually really extraordinary to consider how that history is also part of this story, and that for Anglo-Americans who had just gone to war against the French were so readily able to kind of welcome them with open arms, but not always. I mean, there were discussions about, well, we're trading George III for Louis XVI, or even Louis XV if it were earlier. He dies in 74, but that's the king that Americans had just gone to war against. So, I didn't get into Lafayette too much. There is a really robust lineup of programming about him, and I wanted to take the opportunity to especially shed light on local regional stories from not too far from here, because I think it is sort of surprising. There are a lot of plaques that we walk by and don't always read, and they do tell these stories, but that's a history that's borne out in the objects as well. So I could come back. Thank you, though. My pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you. Thanks. It's great to have a captive audience, and this is a great space. I think the acoustics are pretty good. So, yeah, good. Thanks again. My pleasure. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming out.